we're about to hear our final TEDS presentation for tonight. And we are welcoming Joyce DeTony Hill. She will be speaking with us tonight on Grace and the Reluctant Pilgrim. She started her connectional pilgrimage as pastor in 1987 in West Michigan. She's transferred to the Rocky Mountain Conference in 1999 and traveled to Steamboat Springs from Central UMC Colorado Springs. She's married to Derek, whose name means the way. They have a young adult daughter who shows movies in Hollywood and a dog who likes walks. Joyce is a pilgrim and shares her story about being a reluctant pilgrim. Welcome, Joyce.
I was remarking a little while ago that being last as a TEDS presenter is like waiting for surgery. It's like, we made it to the end. I heard a very interesting statistic fairly recently that said that over the past 13 years, the spiritual act of pilgrimage has increased by a whopping 300% worldwide, as people are now rediscovering the sacred paths, the sacred destinations, just all around the world. And my two favorite definitions of pilgrimage are: pilgrimage is a physical movement through a symbolically charged landscape. And the other one is more spiritual, and that is pilgrimage is a journey into your own resurrection. It is a journey that takes you home. And I would also add home to the heart of God. That's my own addition to that. In my own life, I've had some really good experiences with pilgrimage. I have gone on family heritage journeys. I have been to Cold War, civil rights journeys, pilgrimages in my life. I've been on devotional pilgrimages to Israel, and I'm now preparing. I wore my outfit. I'm now in training to walk the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage trail in Spain in May and June. I'm going to take my time. And so with that kind of a good, solid experience with pilgrimage, you would think that in about 2013, when Bishop Elaine announced that we would be going on the Sand Creek pilgrimage as an annual conference, that I would have been elated. Woohoo! Another journey to go on. But I must confess to you that I wasn't. And the reason is I thought I heard her say that we were going to discover our part in that story. And I found myself arguing and saying, no, whoa, wait a minute. This is not my story. My people were simple farmers from the east at that time. They never made it out west during that period. And this guy Shivington I'm starting to hear about, well, frankly, he just sounds like a criminal. So in my mind, that just did not count. And so here's what I want to put out to us as part of the story tonight is it possible for the Holy Spirit to work through a pilgrim in pilgrimage when that pilgrim is reluctant and is maybe even at times on the worst end kicking and screaming or just really in a bad mood about that. So hold on to that as we go through this story. Well, Bill Selby, anybody in coaching group? Bill Selby often says to us in coaching group that we as pastors are really good at shoulding on ourselves, right? And I have to admit to you that I am the best shooter there is. And if anyone wants any advice about how to do that, I can give you that to you. And so I said to myself, well, this isn't my story, but I should prepare for this pilgrimage, because that is what you do when you go on pilgrimage. You have to be grounded. You have to be prepared. And that is part of the teachings. You have to be open to the teachings. So I said I should do this. And so what I did to prepare for this, we'll go back, is I read every blog that for every month the bishop put a blog out with suggestions about how to be grounded, how to prepare yourself for this journey for the Sand Creek Massacre Pilgrim. So I read them, and actually I was doing pretty well with those suggestions until I got to about April. And I do remember exactly where I was when I read that blog. The blog said something like, to get prepared, the assignment for this month, that's where I was thinking, was, if you know somebody from the Shivington family, why not have a discussion with them about this? And it just hit me really weird. I can't explain it any other way. It was just plain weird. And you have to understand that I am the family genealogist in my family, and our family came over many branches, but the earliest one that I know came over in 1632 with the Winthrop fleet from England to Boston, and that group brought one of the more famous branches of our family, the Aaron Burr family. And one of the things, I've learned is that Aaron Burr was my first cousin 9 generations ago. And, he was vice president, but he was more famous for killing you-know-who, Mr. Hamilton. And his mother was a part of the Jonathan Edwards family. And so that's all pretty cool. And my point is that when your family has been in the United States as long as mine, well, you discover that you are just about related to everybody. And so here's what I did. I went immediately, I remember being in the kitchen, and I went immediately to my genealogy program, and I'm just typing away, and I wondered, am I related to Shivington too? I don't know why. It's what connected for me. And after searching, I discovered, no, I wasn't related to Shivington, nor did I know any Shivingtons. And so therefore, I could rationalize this once again was not my story. But then I also recognized that indeed I had overreacted. Was it a shame trigger? What in the world was going on here? And so when I really thought deeply about this, if I was really honest with myself, the story, the Sand Creek Massacre invitation really did not start with Bishop Elaine. It really started a few months earlier on a family heritage pilgrimage. I've been looking forward to going on this pilgrimage for several years. I wanted to go back to the beautiful Greenbrier Valley in southern West Virginia, near Lewisburg and near the edge of Virginia border. I wanted to go to Hillsboro, West Virginia. It's kind of a little hole in the wall, but very pretty. Hillsboro, West Virginia was founded by my great-grandfather, Richard Hill, 1763, and his son, John. I wanted to go back to his land that held the beautiful Hills Creek Falls. I wanted to go back to the family homestead where Abraham Hill married Sally Burr. I was really excited about some new information that my family shared with me. I wanted, for the first time, to go back after several years to go to the family museum in Marlington, West Virginia, that held a lot of our family lore. And my cousins online told me, you've got to go back and you've got to hold the Bible that your Methodist Calvinist grandmother brought from Wales about 1760 something, real early on in the Methodist movement. I wanted to go to the land of my other grandfather, John McNeil. And I especially wanted to go onto his property that is still in the McNeil family since that mid-1700s. And I especially wanted to find the place on his land where he built what is understood as the first church built west of the Alleghenies. And this was called the White Pole Church and Meeting House that he built. And this is the church that Francis Asbury spoke about in his journals when in 1877 he wrote, Tuesday the 8th, I reached the McNeils, 1788, on the little levels where almost the whole settlement came together, with whom I found freedom in Matthew 11. Our brother Phoebus, who was the pastor assigned to that area, had to answer questions propounded to him until evening. I wanted to walk where Francis Asbury walked. How cool it was there. And so we went on the journey, and when we got to the McNeil homestead, my cousin McNeil welcomed us just like the long-lost cousins we truly were. And he pointed us up to the cemetery, and he said, now, when you get up to the cemetery, I do want you to find the very first grave that was built or dug by our grandmother in 1777 October, I believe it was, 1774 October. She dug it herself because there was no one in the Greenbrier to assist her in all of that. So you go find that. And so Derek and I went up to this, here's the farm, and here's the graveside, one of many. And we went and we looked and we found that beautiful little grave. And we also imagined the White Pole Meeting House and Church where Asbury had walked, and just tried to catch some of that energy and imagination. And as we were going back to our car, I happened to notice a few graves on the periphery. And I'd heard that there were from some reading, and I went over there and I read the signs, and it said something like, Eliza, beloved slave. William, beloved slave. Now, what are slaves doing in a Methodist graveyard? I started to bluster because, we don't agree with that. And then I thought, oh my goodness, this is the South. And I started to sense a shadow starting to appear. And so when we went back to the farmhouse, Cousin McNeil was anxiously awaiting, and he said, so, did you find the grave that our grandmother dug? And I said, yes, we certainly did. And he said, and you do know the story of why she dug that herself? Well, no. And actually, I knew she dug it, but I was thinking, for some reason, she's Methodist Calvinist. She assumed some responsibility. They said she did the service herself. I'm thinking feminist, all weird stuff, but it wasn't even close. And he said with great pride, he said, it is because all the Greenbrier, all the families were fighting Dunmore's War, and they were in Ohio at the Battle of Point Pleasant. And we were fighting Chief Cornstalk, and we won, he said. And Chief Cornstalk relinquished all the lands, the Indian hunting lands, from Kentucky to Ohio, and it opened the West. He was so proud of that, and I found myself horribly embarrassed, to be honest, and the shadow just got deeper and deeper. Then I had my question, and I said, Cousin McNeil, did our family own slaves? Now, Cousin McNeil has written many family books, and he is in his 70s, and I know he's been asked that question before. And he took a deep breath, and he said this. He said, well, I don't know if our family owned the slaves. But do you see that schoolhouse down the road? Now, that is where I went to school, and we went to school with all them coloreds, and we got along just fine. The language startled me. It stung, and it felt so antiquated, and frankly, it felt like a residue left from that region. And I carried that with me as I went to the next place on my journey, we indeed found the museum in Marlington that had all the family stories. And yes, indeed, I found, this is my picture of the Methodist Calvinist Bible that my grandmother Martha brought in the 1760s as already a Methodist. So excited to see that. And I did find a lot of family books that also told about our story. And yes, I read through, because I had something I needed to learn. And yes, I discovered that our family was the largest plantation owners in the area and the largest slave owners in the area as well. And frankly, I just didn't know what to do with that. That is not what I went on pilgrimage to find. I wanted to find my heroes, and Asbury, but I didn't. I found this. And yes, I also found the records where the biggest landowners were, some of them were Hills, some were MacNeils, definitely the Burrs, all the Burrs. And they had many slaves that they passed on along with their other properties. I also found in my readings of these books and more this really interesting, it was like a footnote, but it was in the middle of the pages, and it said the greatest tragedy of all the Greenbrier and the Little Levels was the time when John Hill took his family and half of the Greenbrier families to Missouri. And I was really curious about that because it was like a footnote, but it didn't say anything more. I know that the Battle of Droop Mountain, the Civil War was there, but that wasn't mentioned. This was the biggest tragedy in the history of the Greenbrier. And so it was like there wasn't anything more said, but I thought there was something there, a shadow. And so I did research that when I got home, and I discovered this. Just a few months after John Hill's wife died, John Hill packed up his slave children, the eldest being 10 years old, and their mother, and and took them as well as his grown adult children. And then this is the 1850s, mid 1850s, and the rest of the major slaveholding families took their slaves as well. And they moved to Jamesport, Missouri, Davis County, western Missouri. And I also researched the time frame, and it had been, I believe, just a few months after it had been some broken treaties and the native peoples left. A lot of them did stay in that area and even named some of the communities after those from the Greenbrier. But within 10 years, there were several of those same families who continued on into western Kansas and Wyoming, into the very lands that had belonged to the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. But this wasn't my story, was it? Wow. As I thought about all of that, it occurred to me for the very first time why it was so very important for my parents to tell me story after story about their involvement in civil rights in the 1950s through their Wesley Foundation at West Virginia University. It dawned on me for the first time, and they're big West Virginia storytellers, so I got a lot of them. And it occurred to me that this was a big deal, that involvement, because this was probably not a value shared by the rest of the family, now that I really understood the context from which my family came. And I also began to realize that their stories impacted me, and then my stories impacted my own daughter and her wonderful, diverse friends that she has now as a young adult, and how she sees things, and it's just been passed on. I also began to understand in a whole new way that this is God's story. This is a story, I believe, about a God who is constantly reconciling the world to God's self, one generation at a time, totally into the heart of God. And I believe this is a story about a God who taps me on the shoulder and says, I have been to this place before quite a few times, and I'm glad you're having a good time on your pilgrimage, but I've been here before, and while you're here, there are some things in the shadows I need to show you. I begin to understand that the Sand Creek Massacre experience I was anticipating was going to be just a part of a much longer journey that I had already been on, and that journey is also a part of a much greater journey that I think is about God's story. And so when it came time for the Sand Creek pilgrimage, I rode the bus, and another surprise that I had is I was not expecting at all to get off the bus and to receive ashes. That was just not something I anticipated ahead. And we all got ashes and were met with the words, repent and believe in the gospel. For the first time, I felt like I was experiencing Ash Wednesday. It meant something to me in a whole new way. And so with the ashes, I decided, I'm going to go open, and I'm going to walk into that pilgrimage day with the openness that you're supposed to go, that God is going to teach you something in that space. But here's the other thing. Remember the question from earlier? Is it possible for God to work through a pilgrim? Usually you think about pilgrims as, on this wonderful devotional journey and, come on, God, I'm ready for whatever. But is it possible for God to work through a pilgrim who goes on the pilgrimage with a bad attitude? Reluctant? Resentful? And I have come to determine that, yeah, it is possible. So many people are quoting Antonio Machado. He is a poet who is the one that has coined the word, the way is made by walking. And this one is, travelers, there is no paths, for paths are made for walking. That is Antonio Machado's, the poet, quote. And so when I found that, I went and looked at the whole poem. And I did not see anywhere in that poem that talked about the attitude of the pilgrim. So I'm thinking, yes, indeed, you can, God can work through even a reluctant pilgrim. And yes, you can walk into your own resurrection and that journey. And where are we going on that journey? Well, I believe we're going home to the heart of God. Perhaps some of us one generation at a time, one step at a time. Where are we going? We're going home. It is grace that has brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home to the heart of God. And that is where I am on the journey today. And who knows where it's going to lead tomorrow. So thank you for also being a part of that journey, and thank you so much for your very kind attention.